I apologize for that brief delay that we had here. Always some tech issues associated with these virtual webinars. Guess it really wouldn't be a webinar with some without some tech issues, right? So my name is Carrie Schaefer. I am the project coordinator for EcoAdapt's National Adaptation Forum. I'm going to say a few words here in the beginning and then pass it off to our session moderator, Nikki. So first off, we want to thank our sponsor for this event, the Walton Family Foundation. This entire series was made possible by their generous contribution, and we appreciate them for providing us with the space to discuss these important topics. So for this session and for the rest of the series, which will be one session after this, we will be using GoToWebinar. So I want to take a moment to point out some of the main features here. So hopefully your screen is looking something like this. On the right hand, you're going to see your microphone and speaker settings. So this is where you can adjust where your sound is coming from using those drop-down menus. Using this button here, you will be able to go into full screen mode. And then you'll also see that we have a spot for questions, where you can enter in any questions you may have for our panelists. Although if you would prefer to ask your question out loud, feel free to raise your hand and then I can unmute your microphone so you can speak directly to our presenters. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on is how to get the most out of this session. So first we ask you to remove distractions for the next hour and a half. I know after kind of a year and a half of many of us living in a virtual world, we're used to multitasking, kind of hopping between tabs or half watching as we scroll through our phones. So during this session, we'd like you to try to remove those distractions and give your attention to our speakers and really engage with that material. Next, we ask you to interact with our presenters and with one another. So we really want this session to be as interactive as possible, so feel free to send in those questions or raise your hand during our Q&A session so our presenters can hear your thoughts. In addition, we know that the chat feature is not available in GoToWebinar, so we've created a discussion board in Padlet where we want to encourage you to chat with one another, post questions, or any commentary that you have on the discussion. So for those of you who may not have used Padlet previously, I'm going to take a minute to describe how it works. So at the top, you can see the title of our board, and in yellow are the instructions for posting to the Padlet. If you'd like to create a post, you can click on this little plus sign down here in the bottom right corner. When you click on that plus sign, a box like this is going to pop up for you to enter in your thoughts. So you'll want to type into this bottom section here and then click on that publish button in the top right hand corner. And so now you can see my comment has popped up. And so if you want to like someone else's post, you can like it using that little heart here. And you can also comment on it right below. And so that's just a quick rundown of how we're going to be using Padlet today. I will share that link once we get started with our presentations. And so to wrap up our tips for success, I wanted to mention that this session is the third in a series focused on tribal and indigenous climate adaptation. We would love to have you all tune in for our last remaining session, which will take place on December 1st. And you can register for that session at nationaladaptationforum.org. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to our session moderator, Nikki.
Thank you, Carrie. Yat'e to everyone. She'e Nikki Cooley dashijinne. Kinya ani nishle. Look at the net bashichin. Is a lana e dashinella. Tro ahead line e dashiche. A kot awe the net son nishle. I introduce myself to you in the Navajo, the way. I am of the Tarrant House clan, born for the Reed People clan. My maternal grandparents are of the Water That Flows Together people. Paternal grandparents are of the Many Goats clan. And I come from Shanto and Blue Gap, Arizona, but I'm calling from Kintlana, Flagstaff, Arizona, which is the rightful homelands of the Hopi, Havasupai, Wallapai, Dene, and other Pai tribes and many other tribes in this region. So thank you all for joining us today. Since this webinar today is focused on tribal and indigenous, or well, the series is, I thought it was important that I introduce myself to you in this way, in case I do have relatives listening out there, but also it's respectful to our non-human relatives who are always listening. Again, thank you again for the honor of introducing some amazing speakers that we have today, and I hope you all ask questions or provide your comments. This is the time that you have their attention, and it'd be good to get your thoughts and comments. Without further delay, I'll introduce the next speakers, but I hope they can introduce themselves. I feel it's more rich if they introduce themselves, perhaps in their indigenous way or in their own way. I know Shasta, I think you're Swedish, so but yeah, do it how you want, and I think that makes it a lot more personal too. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Raymond Martinez and Michelle Krasanek. They will be representing the Pueblo de San Ildefonso. So please, everybody, let's give our full attention to our next speakers. Raymond and Michelle, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nikki, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me all right?
You sound great.
Thank you. And like I said, Nikki, thank you for that introduction. The reason why we do a lot of this work is exactly how you introduced yourself. And thank you for that. We proceed in that fashion to work for the animals, for the unborn, for the less fortunate, for all that we hold dear to us. So thank you for that intro. Again, my name is Raymond Martinez from the Pueblo de San Ildefonso. Pohare Owinge is the Tewa name that we have here for San Ildefonso, and it means where the water cuts through. We are literally cut in half by the Rio Grande River, so we have our reservation on each side of the river, west and east. Just a background of the Pueblo here. We are agriculturally based economy with resurgence of traditional arts, really focusing on what made the Pueblo famous was its black on black, high polished pottery by the late Maria Martinez and her family. That was what really put the Pueblo on the map for arts. We are also known for one of the only tribal nations to share a common boundary with a nuclear facility. We sit the Department of Energy, Los Alamos National Laboratory. We share a common boundary. What separates us is a 3-strand barbed wire fence. We approximately about 30 some acres encompasses our land, with a lot of our ancestral domain, which is about 60 some thousand acres, is in National Forest, National Park Service, the Department of Energy, and within the Los Alamos County community, Santa Fe County community, and the Rio Arriba community. And again, with that sharing that common boundary with the facility like Los Alamos, there has been a big concern from the Pueblo as far as contaminants and how climate is affecting that, and how we may have increased threats onto our Pueblo from climate change, along with everything else moving in the direction that it is moving. But with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle to introduce herself also.
Hi, my name is Michelle Krasanek, and I'm a biologist at Abt Associates. I've been working with Raymond and the Pueblo for about 4 or 5 years, kind of trying to understand the contaminant transport from that Los Alamos lab onto the Pueblo, doing some kind of risk assessment work to really understand what these exposures are for members of the Pueblo, and also kind of integrating the work where, you've had some health concerns from just climate change in and of itself, and then you have some health concerns from the contamination, and kind of trying to understand, bridge those two and understand how those interact with one another and try to best mitigate, any sort of health risk to members of the Pueblo. And I really enjoy working with Raymond, and doing this work is really near and dear to my heart. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation and the discussion. And let me share my screen, Raymond, so you can start here.
Thank you.
Oh, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen again.
And just to add for folks, I'm the environmental director for the Department of Environmental and Cultural Preservation. Myself and Michelle are two of a bigger team that we have working on all these projects that we have going on right now. So just a little bit more info.
Do you see the title slide there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so again, Pueblo de Ildefonso climate planning and implementation. I just talked about the Pueblo a little bit and our background and where we sit within New Mexico here. So again, this is a few of the information that I shared also, and then some of our contaminant concerns again have been from the historical operation of Llano and how that has been, contaminants within pockets within our reservation, and now with climate change, we've been hit with wildfires, and recently we did have some flooding in 2013 due to some 100-year storm events that occurred that deposited a lot of these contaminants within our boundary, or even flushed through our boundary and continued on the Rio Grande to another adjacent pueblo. So that's a major concern for us, is that we're seeing these flushes happen, and if the things are continuing the way they are, that's what we're trying to study here. And how do we bring that knowledge that we had prior, our traditional knowledge, into doing some of the works that we have here going on. Go ahead, next slide. So this is what we have here for our climate planning is a timeline of where we started. So we initiated this in 2016. We proceeded to conduct community workshops with elders, youth, managers, a lot of our tribal council and our community, really getting them to what to think about a community vision and climate vulnerabilities. We spent a lot of time with these different groups explaining what we were looking for, what they thought, and what insight they had, or what changes they may be seeing already. So in 2019, we continued community forums to receive community feedback. Again, we received things like some of our elders were noticing that we don't see animals, species like we used to. They are no longer present within our reservation or even our ancestral domain. They noticed that, as far as those being absent, also plant species. In 2020, we held meetings with the Pueblo departments and elders to identify and evaluate potential actions to reduce these vulnerabilities due to climate change. And this really came about with the community's input, how they identified what they thought were vulnerabilities, and how we could work to answer a lot of the questions that they had. Then unfortunately, COVID, really put a damper of us doing a lot of the work, coming together to have these kind of forums. But we continued virtually, and we were able to get a lot of participation. Our community, which was real great, that they thought this was very important, and they continue to help us and proceed in this direction. So in 2021, we did a draft climate plan, action plan, to ensure cultural and traditional will thrive for our future generations. And we wanted this to be a living document that any department or any governmental agency within our Pueblo can use, not just something that's going to be put on the shelf and collect dust. We want this to be something that we can go back and look at. So with that, DECP initiated implementation of the climate actions. So from that, when we were meeting with our community, from here you can see what community visions we have here. We took into some key aspects of community life that are critical to preserve and protect. So, you know, traditional activities, community health, traditional places, infrastructure, and governance. And you can see that there's a lot that fits into that. We'll just go into a portion of it right now, but there's a lot that integrates all that. So in that, developing the climate adaptation actions to preserve and sustain these aspects of community life for future generations. And with that, Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Raymond. So after developing the community vision, we conducted the climate vulnerability assessment. And in undertaking this assessment, we took a systematic approach. So first, we assessed the likelihood that the climate hazard will occur and affect Pueblo activities. And then next, we assessed the severity of impact of each vulnerability on key aspects of the community vision. Should the potential vulnerability occur using DECP's knowledge? And then based on this assessment, we ranked the climate risk score for all vulnerabilities with a ranking between 3 to 5, 5 being higher risk vulnerabilities for each aspect of the Pueblo life, traditional activities, traditional places, community health, and infrastructure and government. And I'm just going to go over one example today for focusing on traditional places. So one of the traditional places vulnerabilities' focus is on sacred sites. And the existence of sacred sites such as sacred springs is culturally important for the community. The sites are affected by climate change. For example, there's changes in water quality or flow. And because of that, they may no longer be visited by the community, and that could lead to a loss of cultural practices, knowledge, language, and traditional ways, which would have big implications for the Pueblo's identity. And all climate could affect sacred sites important to the community. For example, drying conditions can affect the community's ability to access the use of the groundwater to springs. Changes in access to the sacred sites would also negatively affect the community because it would change and could change the Pueblo's identity and language. Therefore, the overall vulnerability score for this sacred site was high. So after completing the climate vulnerability assessment, we developed actions for the vulnerabilities that we believed posed the greatest threats to the community vision. These actions aim to adjust or reduce vulnerabilities to observed or projected climate impacts and to reduce or minimize greenhouse emissions. During these community workshops and discussions, we began to identify climate actions, and we also met with the Pueblo departments through webinars. This was, again, as Raymond mentioned, because of COVID-19, we were still able to continue this via webinars. And we were able to brainstorm additional adaptation actions for each of these high-risk vulnerabilities. And for example, again, looking at the sacred sites, restoration actions around the springs can restore and protect the springs. The Pueblo is interested in removing any invasive vegetation, such as tamarisk trees, and replacing it with native vegetation. And in some locations, they would like to protect springs with fencing. These activities can ensure the Pueblo community can visit the sacred springs and use them for traditional cultural practices. The Pueblo is also interested in protecting groundwater recharge areas at higher elevations in a way that can help maintain the groundwater levels at those springs. And then, as Raymond mentioned, this is just a photo of the cover of the Pueblo's Climate Action Plan. And as Raymond mentioned, this is a living document that will evolve and expand with new knowledge and new data. And as we have more evidence about the impacts of climate change, and as new adaptation strategies are identified. In addition to having this Climate Action Plan, there's also a Climate Action Plan story map, which you could access via this website. And there you can kind of understand a little bit more about the process and actually get a copy of the full Climate Action Plan and just take a view of the story map. And that's something, again, we'd like to share because there's a lot of hard work that went into putting this together. A lot of good information. And then lastly, the Pueblo has been interested in some climate resilience implementation, and DECP is applying or has applied for some grant funding to implement some of these resilience actions. And these are some examples here. One is this BIA resiliency grant that actually we just kind of wrapped up the work recently, where we were evaluating the effects of climate change and contaminant exposure in conjunction with one another. There's also the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center grant, and this grant, the proposal is to help evaluate wildfire landscape management practices that can protect the Pueblo against wildfire-related impacts. And then there's a second BIA resiliency grant that the Pueblo has applied for and gotten funded. This is one that's just starting up now, and this is to support the transfer of traditional agricultural knowledge to youth by developing a resilient farm plan. And then lastly, the Pueblo has applied for this NIDS Coping with Drought grant to protect springs from droughts, to help sustain wildlife and native vegetation, while ensuring that the community the community can visit and use the springs for traditional and cultural practices. So these are just a few examples of trying to implement some of the plan. And lastly, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Raymond or I. This is Raymond's contact information here. Thank you all for listening. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Raymond and Michelle, that was a great presentation. I work for the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals and the Tribes and Climate Change program, so I'm geeking out on this. I think this is fascinating work that you guys are doing, and I'm really proud of our relatives down there for speaking up about the potential impacts from, this nuclear site. And a big fan of ABT and Associates. You guys do some really great work with tribes, so thank you for that. And remember, I remind our audience to go ahead and put questions in Padlet or any comments. Please go ahead and do that. Look to your chat box for that. But Raymond and Michelle will check in with you after Shasta's presentation. So thank you again so much. Without delaying, I could talk about this all day long, but I think we should give some time to our next presenter, who works for one of the tribes that ITEP and a lot of other partners across the country likes to work with. So I'm going to give the floor over to Joshua Rosenau. I hope I said your name correctly. And he's from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe. And I hope you can introduce yourself. And let's give our attention to Joshua. Take it away.
Nikki. Pesquexpesia Joshua Rosenau Luis Suyabisquest Chenes Kulqueltini Tilchen Quail Xalk Ilskeliudo Ilchen Salish Kasanka Sanatzel Minten Luis Kudel Chenes Lemti Hudel Ke Kamil Shietlwa Neke in Kultwish Lucas Bus Ke Oxtuehui Noon. Unech Chenes Lemti Hul Misel, Mike Derglo, Tachin Kulpachnuis Netahul As Kutlum. So I want to thank everyone for coming together today on this problem, which is becoming so increasingly urgent. And I also wanted to thank the people that support me to bring this presentation to you. I'm a non-Indian person. I work at a tribal college where I also help to volunteer with the largely volunteer efforts that the tribe has put together on climate change and adapting to it. So I'm going to begin this presentation here shortly. And okay, can everyone see all right?
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So today's presentation is going to be not about our specific approaches to climate planning, but more of a broader effort that has to do with the challenges of addressing and organizing our response to the problem, which is so huge. And in order to do that, I'm going to draw on the traditional Sally bag, which I'll show you shortly. And this bag is going to be, and the construction of this bag is going to serve as the structure of our now ongoing adaptation efforts. And we think that this is going to be something powerful to share for any community that is struggling because of the huge scope of climate change. Here in this image is Ava Boyd. She has almost single-handedly brought back the nearly lost art of Salish style basket weaving on the Flathead Reservation. She learned how to make split cedar root baskets and Sally bags from her grandma. Eva shares her knowledge through apprenticeships. She recently retired from teaching at SKC. And as a weaver, Eva is recognized as a member of the Circle of American Masters by the Montana Arts Council. This here is Buck Morjo, who is an apprentice, who was an apprentice of Eva's. And thankfully, Eva's still around and Buck's still around too. Salla is the kind of, Sally is the anglicized version of Salla, which is the all-around carry bag. And here Buck is showing some of the warp of the bag as he's constructing it. And this is what a finished and an unfinished bag look like. So how does this relate to climate change planning? Well, in our first plan, we took a rather conventional approach that was adapted thanks in great part to ITEP and Nikki, Cooley, and some other folks that had some early influence on structuring those kinds of meetings and what they were looking like and how to help tribes to hold them. And we had a fantastic first draft, which came out in 2013. The important thing here is that this plan initially was very strong. However, it did have some limitations. The strengths were in the early collection of testimony from elders. And this is especially true in our case because of the 5 elders that you see in the photographs in the plan document there. We have only 1 remaining, Steep and Small Salmon, and I would like to thank him on this call right now. He has been a consistent presence at our meetings. He prays for us. He is our comic relief a lot of the time, and it's just a huge, huge presence that he brings. I'd also like to point out that the man just to his left is Padlet Pierre, who I was honored to know, and he was a friend of mine, and I'm thinking of him today, and I'm wearing a shirt that he gave me from a giveaway that his son gave me, and a hat that his widow gave me, so that his presence is felt here too. The limitation was with the plan was that the structure that we went for is a kind of a kitchen sink structure where we hope that we'll be able to touch on all the different aspects that affect that climate change affects. However, these ended up getting a little bit constrained and somewhat siloed because tribal departments had their own agendas, which is totally fine. They also had their own restrictions and interests as far as money goes. They also had limited ability to come together and connect and have conversations in a deep way about what kinds of projects might present areas of overlap and cooperation. So this is kind of what that resembles. If holistic planning efforts are unstructured, we get this big pile of stuff. In this case, the pile of fiber materials that's used to make a cedar bark basket. So when we look at this, we see that there's not really an idea about scope and scale. It's kind of all over the place. It's chaotic. It can be noisy when it comes to gatherings, you know, loud voices or voices that seem to be the ones that have the most pressing concern, or maybe they have a emergent issue that's making them kind of the climate issue of the month. They can sometimes be wasteful too when efforts are repeated without departments knowing that, oh, this person was doing that too. And largely they're reactive. In other words, they're not responding, they're not implementing a plan that's in place. Instead, they're reacting to news about climate, or they're reacting to those people who feel that it's most pressing in this particular form or this particular implementation area. And that's to be contrasted with the holistic planning effort, which, as we look at this basket, is a lot different. It's balanced, it's beautiful, it's practical, and there's a kind of overall composition to it. And it's been our insight that this is the kind of structure that really we're needing and we're lacking when it comes to taking on the huge scope. So a little bit about these baskets. Traditionally, they were made from cedar bark and corn husks, excuse me, and the Salish word for them is kakepet. This was then later sort of adapted and often made today using mop heads. You know, I had the pleasure of taking the class from Eva on how to build these things, and she talked about how when she was little, there was no money for yarn, and so her parents would go to church rummage sales and things, and she would have the chance to buy maybe a sweater with a hole in it, take it apart, and find the yarn that way. And the point here is that the tribe used everything, wasted nothing. This is a central point in the cultural section of the plan. It is also a part of the testimony that was given by elders. And it's really in honoring that testimony that we wanted to revamp the first plan so that it was you know, more capable to take on the larger problems. In order to do that, we held gatherings, and this here on the bottom left and right are Mike and Jim Derglo. They're sort of the dynamic duo of CSKT's climate change adaptation community. And there in the bottom in the middle is steep and small salmon. There's too many people in this image to thank, but this is just a small group of the cohort that Mike has now. I think it's, you know, approaching 100 people on his email list. So we're really the beneficiaries of a large volunteer cooperative effort. Jim Derglo, in response to the organizational problems that the first plan brought, rearranged them so that instead of having a stack of unorganized, or I should say less organized sectors that also corresponded to departments, he reorganized them in more traditional circular or wheel fashion, hoop fashion, with culture in the middle, surrounded by tradition, spirituality, ceremony, and song, and then with those sectors surrounding that. So this became the base of the next draft of the plan. This is the artist's rendering of that, which we are so thankful for. This was a volunteer who took this on himself, and he made this draft of what would be the base of the reorganized model. This is what we're calling a Lifeways model, and like the previous speaker, the emphasis was on having it become a living document. And there were some lessons that we learned from it, which were that natural resources are cultural resources. This was a traditional piece of traditional testimony as well that we felt was being de-emphasized by the earlier organization. And as a part of this, we learned that all plans depend on interconnection and integration. And so this plan deals with that in two ways, this reorganization, I should say. So the first way that it does it is, instead of thinking of that stack of departments and going department by department, our gatherings try to include everyone who touches on these sectors and kind of going around in a circle and touching base. The second way that it addresses like how to touch on all the interconnections is through scope. So it kind of moves in and out along individual, family, community, culture, tribe, nation, and world, so that we're interacting on multiple different fronts and levels as we consider what to do. So in this case, what these look like are, this is the base of the basket now, and we have the 9 sectors arranged in a circle, overlapping. This is the bottom of the basket again, and we'll show you the warp in a second, but the warp is a metaphor for the existing strengths and capacities of a sector or department. These are the things you can do. This is the cash you have on hand. It's the people that are willing. It's the, in some cases, the intellectual or institutional capital or knowledge that a person brings. So this is kind of like the kitchen sink, but now we're saying that that's just one part. The weft is the existing plans that these departments and sectors and the folks representing them bring. We don't want people to feel like they have to abandon their initial responsibilities in order to participate in climate planning. They should feel like, no, existing plans might even be things that we can draw on and use for leverage. But climate change plans are also involved. So there's a kind of tension between these. And as you'll see in the next slide, the warp and the weft come together through a process called twining. And it looks like this: the original plans, the pre-existing plans, and the climate change plans move back and forth between groups as they learn, oh, well, maybe water has some tie-in with forestry, or maybe culture has some tie-in with infrastructure. And eventually we get around to tying them all together. Another point here, another point of emphasis, is that when we do it this way, it is incredibly strong. The organization has a tendency to want to hold its shape rather than simply fall apart because it's loose and chaotic. So the current state of planning looks a lot like this basket that's starting and getting underway. Some departments are coming together, but there's lots of loose ends yet to tie up. So here's some lessons learned. We have an existing plan that involved people and infrastructure that has to do with the tribe's pre-disaster mitigation plan. Here, this is Dale Nelson, who is head of the emergency services for the tribe. He noticed in 2016 that there was a potential, even though the Trump administration had demanded that people change their wording from climate to words about severe weather, climate, and severe weather, drought, and flood. So he picked up on that, and he used it as an opportunity to fold in our climate change strategic plan, the first draft, so that now every time this pre-disaster mitigation plan is submitted to the federal government, or every time that it is used as a planning document in response to a disaster, the climate change strategic plan is included as a part of it. I think that this is a huge breakthrough on the part of the tribe, and it's probably a model that could be repeated everywhere. I don't see that there's any real barrier to this. I think it could be a best practice. The second also involved people and infrastructure. In this case, It was the tribe's government offices having an interest in increased efficiency, which then that led to the arrival of CSKT Climate Policy Fellow Amira Webster, who's conducting a greenhouse gas audit of CSKT government buildings. This was something that happened much in a way independent of the climate change adaptation planning group, but she was able to plug into it, and she is definitely an integrated part of it now. Here's another example. In the late 90s, and admittedly this is going back in time, which I'll explain later, but in the late the 90s, the Montana DOT was basically telling tribes that it was going to expand the Highway 93 corridor, which is a corridor, it's a right-of-way that is guaranteed by treaty. So this allowed the tribes to negotiate with the state about certain mitigations to hazards to wildlife. And because those interests in wildlife also touched on things like the traditional culture, but also the fact that traditional hunting practices of subsistence that key into those species were species that were of concern in terms of vehicle strikes. What came as a result of this is what's called Huihuayuth in Chadleus, the animal bridge wildlife crossing, which helps to mitigate those problematic vehicle strikes with animals like Scutisimier, mountain lion. Oh, and that was Whisper Camel Means who spearheaded that. Another example, the pre-existing plan from 1938 to 2015, the BIA operated Kerr Dam, which it then later through negotiations ceded to the tribes. Just 2 years after the tribes took over management of it, quagga mussels and zebra mussels were detected in waters in Montana. And if you know anything about these guys, they have the ability to change entire freshwater ecosystems. They also have the ability to choke hydroelectric infrastructure with their shells. And this was an extremely pressing concern. It was of such high priority that our climate change folks changed gears and did whatever we could to organize how to handle it. In response, the folks in those different departments were able to find money for boat check stations, and Mike Dergalo helped to create an annual mussel walk where tribal youth monitor the shores of Flathead Lake and have some chance to do some real freshwater biology in their search for these troublesome characters, these zebra and quagga mussels. Finally, the best for last, the tribes had developed, in order to help their restoration efforts in forestry, they had developed existing greenhouse capacity through both forestry and through the division of fire. And when the silvicultural interests of the tribe as a timber tribe came together with some of the wildlife and fisheries and water interests, we began to see a huge potential for a project around Stilpark, which is white bark pine. White bark pine is a keystone species that of high elevations. Scientists have counted dozens, sometimes approaching 100 species that feed on its seeds. It also has some very interesting characteristics that allow it to help snowpack to accumulate and manage water and temperature in these high mountain areas. And so in this case, we found a project that touches on all 9 of our sectors. And this was something that was really inspirational. So here's another example.
Hey, Josh,
yes.
I don't know how many more slides you have. We have to give some time over to Shasta. I hate to interrupt, but
it's all right.
Yeah,
I'll finish up. This is some educational material that relates to climate. Finally, I'll get through this. Basically, if you keep going long enough, you keep building, you'll make a basket. This is like where Buck was at with his basket. It's coming, promise. So finally, oops, I'll go back. The takeaway here is that tradition and adaptation can inform one another. They don't have to look separate. They can coexist. So thank you, and I'm sorry to take up too much time.
No worries, Joshua. Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I love all your special effects. That really was very descriptive, and I really commend you and the rest of the climate team for coming up with a wonderful, I don't know, just a wonderful presentation, and the work that you do is very much respected. Joshua, we'll check in with you after Shasta's presentation, but the next woman needs no introduction. I'll have I love working with her too. So Shasta Gaughen from the Paula Department of well, it's from the Paula tribe, so take it away.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks, Josh. That was great. I was really loving the baskets and wishing that I could be there to learn myself how to do that. But I am Shasta Gaughen, and I am the environmental director for the Paula Band of Mission Indians in San Diego, California, better known to me as Payomkawitchum territory, or the Roseno ancestral and traditional lands. And as Nikki mentioned in the beginning, I am not Indigenous myself. My ancestry is European, primarily Swedish, but also Polish, Irish, German, and Scottish. So my ancestors came here in the 1800s. And I've been working for Paula since 2005, so going on 17 years. And I've been doing a lot of work on climate change. That's one of our main focuses here at the tribe. And we've done our climate vulnerability assessment, we've done our adaptation planning, although of course, those are documents that go through continuous review as we implement some of our strategies, and we make changes depending on the results of that implementation. But we had an opportunity to do another project that was specific to transportation resilience. And let me talk just a little bit about the overview of that project. We partnered with another tribe in the southern part of San Diego County in Kootenai lands, and that is the Hamul Indian Village. And we were fortunate to get funding through the state of California through Caltrans, or the California Department of Transportation. They have sustainable planning grant opportunities, and we were able to leverage those funds as a tribe to develop this transportation and climate change planning project. And the thing is that not a lot of people really think about the impacts of climate change on their transportation infrastructure. But this is something that we've discovered in doing our climate planning is really important as part of assessing the vulnerabilities of the tribal community. So, and I'm going to talk about the reasons for that in just a moment, but partly too, doing the collaboration is really important, because one of the things we really take pride in doing is doing these plans and assessments so that we can also provide templates and our experiences to other communities, tribal communities, so that they can learn from what we have done here in Paula. And so partnering with Hamul, which is much smaller and in a much different transportation situation than we are in Paula, we were able to see what things might be like for that smaller community versus where we are, where we have a few more roads and things to deal with. Although, quite honestly, Hamul's situation is a little bit more difficult than ours is because they only do have one major road going through their reservation. So we start as usual in the process by doing a vulnerability assessment. That's always the key thing to begin with when you're doing any sort of climate change adaptation planning. You've got to identify your key vulnerabilities. And then based on that, you can prioritize the vulnerabilities. What are the ones that are the most important that you need to address first, and fold those into your adaptation plan, which, as I said, is a cycle of adopting, implementing, evaluating, and then updating. So again, we were trying to develop something that was going to be useful not just for Paula and Hamul, but was collaborative so that we can help other tribes with their transportation resilience projects here in California, but also hopefully across the nation. And that's part of our Tribal Climate Health Project as well, which is another project funded through the BIA and the National Indian Health Board, where we develop climate and health tools for tribes. So this is just a short list of climate change and transportation vulnerabilities, and I encourage those of you who are listening, if you want to go over to the Padlet, I would love to see what the rest of you could add to this list of climate change and transportation vulnerabilities. So we just brainstormed and we came up with some of the obvious ones, like access to critical services. If there are impacts, climate-related impacts to your roads, your bridges, your infrastructure, then you're going to have potential issues with access to critical services. What are critical services? Healthcare is a critical service. Access to vulnerable populations, people who may be stuck in their homes. If you have no roads to get to them, how are you going to help those people? How are the fire trucks getting in? How are the ambulances getting in? How are people getting out? The effects on roads and bridges, thankfully we now have the Build Back Better infrastructure bill that's been passed by the Biden administration, but we know that a lot of other vulnerabilities exist in transportation besides just roads and bridges, but those are the main ones that we have to contend with. And that stuff is out of date, it's old. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, their responsibility for roads, BIA roads within tribal communities, they are not always up to date on those road inventories and keeping those roads in passable condition. Climate change makes that worse, whether it's flooding, whether it's high heat. We know that some high heat days in the desert Southwest, like in Phoenix, have been so severe that cars or planes can't taxi down the runway because it's too hot for the tires. I already mentioned evacuation routes. We need to know how people are going to get into and out of their communities when there is some sort of an emergency or a disaster. What about food and water distribution? That uses our transportation infrastructure. And for some communities like the Diné, the Navajo Nation, there are people who have to travel to pick up their water. What happens if those roads are affected by a flood and they are unable to pass on those roads and get to their clean water or to food sources? Of course, there are increased costs as a consequence of climate impacts on roads and transportation. And then impacts to economic drivers. So for us specifically here in Paula, that means are people able to get to the tribal casino, which is the main economic resource for us. But for other tribes, that might be access to fields for harvest or to other operations. And again, if the roads and the transportation infrastructure are not up to speed, pun intended, then it's not easy to get to those things. And again, there's more, so I would love to see your ideas if you want to add them to the Padlet. So when we talk about climate change, there are 5 major exposures, and just listed here briefly: temperature extremes, wildfire, storms and flooding, drought, and then melting ice and sea level rise. These are the primary exposures that can lead to all sorts of potential impacts, but for us, we're interested mostly in health and community impacts. So what are the impacts of wildfire and high heat, for example, on air quality? We know that obviously wildfire smoke has an effect on people with asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. that when there's drought, there's more dust from roads, and so that can be a contributor to worsened asthma and other respiratory conditions. So there's all sorts of things that are linked to the classic climate exposures that we are all concerned about. And not all of these are an impact in Paula. We don't have to contend with melting ice and sea level rise in Paula, but there are many communities, especially our tribal communities in Alaska, that are very much affected in terms of their roads and their transportation by melting ice and sea level rise. So I'm going to use Paula as the example so I can give you all an idea of what we did, and hopefully if you're interested in doing something similar for your community, you can learn from our experience. So our focus area is on the center of the Paula Reservation primarily, which is what we call the village. And Paula is about 13,000 acres, which is large by San Diego County standards, where we have 18 individual tribal governments here, 18 reservations. Actually 19 reservations and 18 tribal governments. So 13,000 is big by San Diego standards, but I know it's very small by the standards of, say, Salish Kootenai or the Navajo Nation. But so this is our map that addresses and identifies our critical infrastructure and our transportation assets. So first of all, if you're talking about transportation, you're talking about roads. So we have a roads network that is a BIA road network, but our main transportation arteries are state and county. So we have Highway 76, which is a state highway, and then Paula Mission and Paula Temecula roads, which are rights of way to the county of San Diego. These are the only roads, the main roads through Paula. So you can go north on Paula Temecula Road to the city of Temecula, just over the San Diego Riverside County border, or 76 goes east to west, west to Interstate 15, or east to other reservations and more rural areas. So if something happens and any of those three access points is blocked, we're kind of trapped here. So that's the first thing that we are concerned about, is what is the condition of our roads, of the actual transportation itself. But what is related to that is things like gas and electric distribution. What are the roads where our utility companies, San Diego Gas and Electric, for example, will have access to power poles if there's a power outage? What if the roads that they need to travel to get to those access points are not available? We need to make sure that those are resilient. We have destinations, so things like the casino, which is number 7 on the map here, or the tribal administration complex, which is number 12. These are important places people need to be able to get to. Emergency response, we have tribal law enforcement, we have the Paula Fire Department, and then of course, residents and their neighborhoods. So the things we identified as having the most potential impact on our transportation infrastructure, we started with temperature extremes. And so just looking at the climate exposure facts for this region, we see that we're going to have an increase in days with a temperature of over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So obviously the temperature is rising globally, and that means that there's a significant shift for us here locally, seeing a possibility of up to a 7.3 degree increase by 2071, which incidentally is the year that I will turn 100. So even though I probably won't be here, I'm still concerned about the impacts on future generations from that kind of temperature increase. So what do we see? Seasonal shifts, it's funny, it says more extreme cold events on here, which I think is actually supposed to say more extreme heat events. So apologies for that. But in San Diego, we're going to see heat increases. We're not going to see extreme cold events increase. So this is the data that we have to work with. And we know that that kind of heat has an impact on the longevity of things like asphalt. It also has an impact on the amount of road dust that is produced, the amount of ground level ozone that is produced by those roads and people passing on those roads. So they are all connected to climate change vulnerabilities. And then what about drought? If you live in the Southwest or California, drought is just a normal part of your life. What other people think of as drought for us is probably a good rain year. So severe drought in the Southwest is like a few inches of rain in any given rainy season. And so we have to be very, very aware of the impacts of drought. Here in Paula, we rely completely on groundwater for our drinking water and our sewer system. So we have to be aware of what the potential is for being able to access our water. What are the roads that go to our wells? Are we going to be able to service them and manage those? What kind of dust is being produced when the ground is drier? When there's less precipitation, then obviously there's more dust. And then also there's less plant cover. So our plant families and our plant communities, they are not able to withstand the heat and the drought. And so with less plant cover, that means that you actually have more erosion, and when rains do come, that potentially makes things even worse on the roads than they would have been if it wasn't a drought year. Storms and flooding, it's ironic. We talk about drought and wildfire here all the time. We don't really talk that much about storms and flooding, but what happens is because of the drought and because of the high heat, it actually packs the earth. It gets so dry and so hard that when the storms do come, the water is more likely to run off than it is to absorb into the ground. So what we're finding is that roads that used to be able to absorb the floodwaters are now turning into rivers during rain events. And we put up a map for our tribal members and people living in the community. They could put pins in the map showing places where the roads became impassable during what was otherwise an ordinary rain that wouldn't have created floods in the past, but it's causing problems for people to be able to get in and out of their neighborhoods, or in some cases even get out of their houses. In the last big rain that we had that caused significant flooding in Paula, we had to rescue one of our tribal members using a boat because she couldn't get out her front door. Not something you would normally expect in a place with drought. So when the rain comes, it is severe, and that has an effect on our road system. And our bridge system, the San Luis Rey River has two crossings that go to the south part of the reservation. One has a bridge, the other does not, so it becomes impassable during rain. So here's how we overlaid the storms and flooding onto the map of Paula and our critical infrastructure that was identified in the first map. We have the access roads. We have Highway 15 over on the left side, showing that that's the main place we need to be able to access to be able to leave the reservation if necessary during a flooding event. But like I was just saying, we have problems with a lot of the dirt roads on the reservation in that when these severe storms happen during drought times, we end up having flooding that keeps people from being able to get out. Plus, we have more erosion. We have more rocks and mudslides onto the roads. Paula Temecula Road is a very windy, very curvy, one-lane road, and accidents on that road are a regular occurrence even when the weather isn't dangerous. So that's another thing we have to consider is what's our evacuation route going to be if our normal routes of evacuation aren't accessible? Wildfire is another huge concern for us. Just like with storms and flooding, we need to have evacuation routes, and we know that wildfire is projected to increase as the climate warms. I'm hopeful that a lot of the push now to reintroduce traditional burning and cultural burning practices in California means that we will have less threat from wildfire. But until that happens and the habitat returns to more of a managed equilibrium, we have to worry about burn. So you can see on this map, all the red parts, these are places that are most significantly impacted by the threat of wildfire. And wildfire obviously has an impact on roads, bridges. I mean, a bridge can burn, and so can asphalt if it gets hot enough. And if we have vegetation on the sides of roads that's going to go up in flames, even if the road itself isn't burning, that becomes a dangerous route for people to be getting out of the places that are at risk. So we already have high fire hazard severity in San Diego County, definitely in Paula. So that was another vulnerability that we had to consider. And again, here's the map similar to the flood map showing the most critical aspects of our infrastructure and overlaying it with areas that have experienced fire. And actually, since this map was made, it needs to be updated. We had a fire on the very western edge of the reservation along that purple line that nearly came into the community. So we have a new fire area that we need to map onto this graphic. So our exposures, when we ranked the exposures by risk level, they all came out as high. So, well, except we don't have melting ice and sea level rise on there for reasons I already explained. But we took this information to the community and we gave them a survey. And this is just one example of one of the answers of what are people the most concerned about in Paula. And we see that wildfire definitely makes the top cut. But then, as I mentioned, storms and flooding also was one of the #1 things that people were concerned about. Less concerned about temperature extremes and drought, but when you start to tell people about how drought and wildfire are related to storms and flooding, suddenly that becomes a bigger issue for people, and the same with the temperature extremes. So this list is the potential transportation-related impacts resulting from climate change that we identified for Paula. But as I said in the beginning, these are also going to be applicable to a lot of other communities. So that's why I have at the bottom here, we have A through N, and N is others. There may be some that are very specific to your community. These are the things that we identified for Paula. So, just picking at random, decrease in exercise because of a limited use of active transportation. So, if the roads and the asphalt are radiating so much heat that you can't walk on them without potentially, burning your feet or melting your bike tires, that's going to decrease people's ability to get out into the fresh air and get some exercise. Or the increased costs, that's a huge one. The increased costs to the tribal government for road repair because of damage to roads. These are things that we need to plan for in our adaptation strategies. And again, this is just our infrastructure map, showing again that we have a lot of areas in Paula that are fairly concentrated, which means that when we do have a transportation infrastructure issue, it's going to affect everybody at the center of this map. Like I said, we call this the village. We have some people who live south of the river, and they have a lot of issues too because it's all dirt roads over there. And so they're most likely to be impacted by flooding, by erosion, and by dust. So overall, we have a lot of different things we need to consider in our transportation plan. But like I said, first step, identify those vulnerability assessments and then start to consider identify those vulnerabilities and start to consider how you can potentially adapt and find ways to manage those risks. Just one more again with the flood risk. This is as we started to work with one of our consultants, we engaged with a local consultant who was able to make these maps for us and overlay all of these different potential hazards. So these are the flood hazards showing where it's most likely to flood. We do have a FEMA flood map, and again, because we're drought prone here, we don't really think about getting flood insurance, but it's something that everybody should consider because you never know when it's going to happen. So we have a lot of potential just because we're in the San Luis Rey River basin, and essentially the entire reservation is within that floodplain. Again, same thing with the fire history. It's always good to have your maps. These are things that we shared with the community. So again, they could point out what their concerns were, where they live, the places where they've experienced transportation difficulties. We have one traffic signal on the reservation, but we had to consider what happens if there's a fire or a high wind event where we have a public safety power shutoff to try to protect the community from starting more fires, but then our traffic signals don't work. So that's another vulnerability. And I'm going to end it there because I could talk a lot about all the things that we're dealing with here, but I want to give opportunities for folks to have questions and comments. And so with that, I am going to turn it back over to Nikki. Thank you.
Yeah, Shasta, very interesting. I know that's a rising topic around in climate change. People are including transportation and should have been including it a lot more. So if all the presenters are knowledge holders, as I like to call them, go ahead and pop up on the camera screen. That would be great. And I'll go through some questions. We have about maybe 10 minutes. So the first question on Padlet, I think this is for anybody, but we can go to Raymond and Michelle first. The question was, what were the biggest challenges associated with plan development or plan implementation? What do you guys think?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I think for us was just really trying to get everybody to think about what we were trying to engage in. Is like there was that learning curve, right? As far as, from going from the youth to the elders to how the government fits in, how other parties all fit into this. So I think trying to collaborate on all that and how thinking about that, because one of the interesting things that we saw, and this came from the youth, was on climate change, was heat. They saw an increased temperature rise, right? And one of the youth said, "Well, my grandma and grandpa get mad at me because it's hot." And we thought that was interesting that they're thinking about that they're more agitated when it's warmer, right, or when it's colder. They were using examples like that they could see. Well, my mom or my dad or my grandma, grandpa, they get more agitated with me when it's either cold or hot or something like that. So that was interesting to see, but also trying to figure out, well, how do we take that and use that to say, well, on the government side, need to look at projects that take that into consideration, right? Either going green, putting in AC units with HVACs, with the proper filters and those kind of things, and being able to lobby for that kind of funding to be able to put these projects in. So it was a little combination, I think, of everything that was kind of difficult to trying to get everybody to start thinking of how does climate affect us in different ways.
Thank you, Raymond. I just want to mention that the Paula Band of Mission Indians in Shasta, they have a great tribal climate health project that they really discuss the mental, spiritual impacts of climate change. So your young people are right on track. They know what, they know it, they feel it. So perhaps we can go ahead and move on to Joshua. What do you think about, I don't know if you can answer the question, the challenges. I think you talked about one of them, which, not challenges, that was just the kind of like the limitations.
Yeah, so related to kind of departments being siloed when it comes to these volunteer efforts around climate change, because let's face it, we know that sometimes there's not a lot of money for this right now. Hopefully it's coming, hopefully it's becoming more professional. But related to that is meeting people where they're at. Realizing that just because somebody's got a job to do and that they've got to run to Walmart and that they've got to get their kids to ball practice and then they've got to go home and sleep and get back to work, it is just part of life. And so you have to be willing to understand that limitations are not, they're not a hard no. They don't mean that the person doesn't want to cooperate or that they're flaking or that, and so all of that struggle to get wider cooperation, and that involves listening too, which is always a challenge, I think, when as a plan is being constructed, keeping the open ear at the same time that you're focusing on the information of highest import. It's a balance to be struck. So those are things that I would say are important to our process, and that they might crop up in someone else's.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Shasta, you have any thoughts on the challenges with the plan development?
Yeah, so I definitely piggyback on what my colleagues here have said, but I think for us, one of the biggest challenges was just getting people to recognize that it's important and that we need their input. So for a lot of folks, they recognize the impacts of climate change, but they're not necessarily linking them to the actual, weather events or, the extremes that are happening. And trying to educate people about that was a challenge. And I finally learned that rather than say, oh, we're doing a climate change vulnerability assessment or a climate change and transportation assessment, I just started asking, all right, well, what's tough for you when you're having to drive? I'm not going to tell you why there's more dust. We're not going to get into the origins of the wildfires or the heat. Just tell me what you're struggling with. And once we did that, people were like, oh, heck yes. We have all this traffic and, I'm afraid to let my kids go out and walk on the roads because it's so dusty and they have asthma. And we didn't even have to bring up climate change. But yet people were still able to tell us what they were concerned about. And that was a hard thing for me to wrap my mind around at first, because all the time I'm just like, climate change. But you don't have to talk about it to get people to tell you what they're experiencing.
Thank you, Shasta. Definitely. I mean, the highway I've driven from Yuma, the back way into San Diego, and we go right by all the different reservations, including Hamul, and that place is so crowded. And this is exactly what I thought about, and this is what I think about all the time. What are the vulnerabilities wherever I'm going? But to live there, I can't. I can only imagine, you know. So Michelle, I'm wondering from a consultant perspective, what maybe can you tell us about one challenge you see in the implementation or the climate development or the plan development?
Yeah, I think in our case, having to do things virtually, trust is very important, and we're, outsiders, and having to do things virtually can be a little difficult during COVID and whatnot. So I think that, that's a major challenge. And, thankfully we've been working with the Pueblo for a while, and we've established a relationship, but it still makes things a lot more difficult than being able to be face to face and talking to somebody in the same room, as opposed to through the screen, potentially a stranger that you've never met. Why are you asking me all these questions? So I think that was tough. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Yes, definitely a common problem for a lot of us. But yeah, especially with Indigenous communities, we like to gather in person, and a lot of our ceremonies and our prayers and our family events are in person. But with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and start to hand it back over to Carrie. But I want to mention, Joshua was talking about these events, these gathering events, and I've been fortunate to attend one of them. And I'm so surprised. I was surprised to see people from like the social services department, the emergency services department, not just environmental departments, at these gatherings that the tribe convenes. So it's very impressive, and I think if you have any questions, you should contact them. They're one of the leaders, as all of the folks on this call are. And I just want to mention that you all have shared amazing knowledge, and it's very inspiring. And I appreciate the National Adaptation Forum and EcoAdapt for allowing this platform to have your voices heard. 479 people registered and about 140 attendees. So that's a huge amount that you have reached across the country. And whatnot. So I just cannot thank you enough for your time. If you can check out Padlet, there's some great comments in there. We tried to answer some of them. But if not, I recommend that you contact our relatives that were sharing their knowledge today directly. So we're running out of time, but thank you again. In the Navajo way, thank you so much. I'm very pleased and I'm very honored to have been in your presence today. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Carrie.
All right, thank you, Nikki, and thank you to all of our speakers today. This was a really excellent session. I just have a few slides that I am going to share here at the end with just some announcements from the National Adaptation Forum. So let's see, I got to minimize myself here a little bit. So our in-person National Adaptation Forum is going to be back in 2022. And so let's see if I can forward it. So it will be in the fall of 2022. We are going to announce our venue and dates very soon. So stay tuned. You can either subscribe to our newsletter or check out our website for that announcement. And not long afterwards, in December, we are going to be releasing our call for proposals. So if you're interested in presenting at the forum, please keep an eye out for that announcement. And last but certainly not least, we invite you all to attend the last session of this series that will be held on December 1st. This is going to be a really interesting session where we have some filmmakers and people featured in Inhabitants and Indigenous Perspective, which is a documentary, coming to talk about the documentary and how it was filmed and some of the stories that were told. So you can register for that session on nationaladaptationforum.org, and we hope to see you all there. So That's all I have for today. I want to thank our speakers and our moderator, Nikki, again for putting in the time to share their knowledge with us today. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.